Welcome to the BBRCM Podcast. I'm Judith, and today we're diving into something that most organizations completely overlook: the January culture reset. It's a phenomenon that happens every single year, yet somehow it catches leaders off guard time and time again. Joining me is Elizabeth, who's going to help us understand why this particular moment in the calendar matters so much more than leaders realize, and what's really at stake when we miss it. Elizabeth, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Judith. I'm really glad we're talking about this because January is one of those deceptive moments in organizational life. Everyone thinks they understand it, they've been through it dozens of times, but very few leaders actually leverage it the way they could, and even fewer recognize what's really happening beneath the surface.
So let's start right there. What are leaders facing right now that makes January so critical? What's different about this moment compared to any other time of year?
Well, think about what just happened across organizations everywhere. December arrived, and companies spent those final weeks either sprinting frantically toward year-end goals or coasting into the holidays. Teams scattered for time off. Some people took a few days, others took a few weeks. And now, in January, they're back. Everyone's returned to their desks, logged back into their systems, rejoined the meetings. But here's what most leaders miss. People didn't just take time off. They reset. They reflected. They recalibrated what they're willing to tolerate and what they're not. They had conversations with family and friends about their work. They had space to think about whether they're in the right place, doing the right work, with the right people.
That's a really important distinction. So it's not just about coming back refreshed and ready to tackle new goals?
Not at all. It's so much deeper than that. January is when the gap between what leadership says matters and what people actually experienced in the previous year becomes most visible. If there was a disconnect, if there were unaddressed tensions or unfulfilled promises, if people felt undervalued or overworked or ignored, they come back in January with fresh eyes and significantly less patience. The tolerance they had in November is gone. The benefit of the doubt they were giving in October has evaporated. They've had time away to gain perspective, and that perspective often isn't favorable.
That's a sobering reality. Why does this topic matter right now specifically? What's the urgency?
Because we're in an environment where talent has real options and organizational trust is more fragile than it's been in decades. Leaders are focused on strategic planning, setting ambitious new goals, launching initiatives, restructuring teams. All of that feels important and urgent. But if the culture isn't ready, if people don't believe in the foundation, if they don't trust that this year will actually be different, none of that strategy will land. It'll just be more noise. January is the moment when you either intentionally rebuild that foundation or you watch it crack further. And once it cracks, it's exponentially harder to repair.
So let's get into the core of this. What's the main pattern you see organizations missing when it comes to January?
The pattern is this. Leaders treat January as a strategic reset, but they completely ignore the cultural reset that's already happening, whether they acknowledge it or not. They're intensely focused on what the organization needs to do differently this year. New revenue targets, new product launches, new efficiency initiatives. But they're not asking the more fundamental question: what needs to shift in how we operate, how we communicate, how we treat each other, how we make decisions? That's where the real reset needs to happen.
That's a crucial distinction. Can you give us a concrete example of what that looks like in practice?
Absolutely. I worked with a mid-sized tech company last year, about 300 employees. They came into January with what looked like all the right pieces: an ambitious but achievable growth plan, new OKRs that were clearly articulated, a restructured leadership team designed to improve decision-making speed. They'd spent December planning all of this. The strategy was solid. The financial projections made sense. But what they didn't address, what they didn't even acknowledge, was that their teams had spent the previous year feeling chronically overworked, consistently undercommunicated with, and almost entirely disconnected from leadership decisions that directly affected their work.
So they had the strategy right, but missed the cultural foundation.
Exactly. And it wasn't that leadership was unaware of the problems. They knew morale had taken a hit. They knew people were tired, but they thought the new strategy would fix it. They thought, if we just give people a clear direction and exciting goals, that'll re energize everyone. That's a very common assumption, and it's almost always wrong.
So, what actually happened when they rolled out this new strategy?
The strategy rollout fell completely flat. Not because it was a bad strategy. The strategy itself was actually quite good, but no one trusted that this time would be different. People had heard ambitious plans before. They'd been through restructures before, and nothing had fundamentally changed in how they experienced work. So when leadership presented this new vision in January, people were polite in the all-hands meetings. They nodded along. They asked a few questions, but privately in the hallway conversations and the Slack channels leadership wasn't in, they were already disengaged. The prevailing sentiment was, here we go again. By March, just 2 months later, they were seeing higher voluntary turnover than they'd experienced in 2 years, and it was their best people leaving first.
That's such a costly miss, and I imagine it created even more problems down the line.
It did, because now you have a demoralized team that's also understaffed. You have remaining employees picking up the work of people who left, which reinforces the exact problem that drove people away in the first place. And you have leadership that's confused and frustrated because they thought they did everything right. They had a plan. They communicated it. Why didn't it work? And the answer is they skipped the cultural foundation. They tried to build on ground that wasn't stable.
So, what could they have done differently? If you could rewind to that January, what would the alternative approach look like?
If leadership had used January to first acknowledge what happened the previous year, to have real, honest conversations about what needed to change culturally before launching into new strategic initiatives, they could have created the conditions for that strategy to actually work. That might have looked like town halls where leaders said, we know last year was hard, we know we didn't communicate well, we know decisions felt opaque. Here's what we're going to do differently, and here's how you'll know we're actually doing it. Then, and only then, introduce the strategy, because now people might actually believe it's possible.
So, what's the fundamental tension here? Why do leaders keep missing this opportunity year after year?
The tension is between urgency and readiness. Leaders feel intense, urgent pressure to move forward quickly, to show momentum, to demonstrate to the board, to investors, to stakeholders that this year will be different and better. There's pressure to have the plan ready, to communicate it early, to get everyone aligned and moving. That urgency is real and it's understandable. But that urgency often completely overrides the equally important need to ensure people are actually ready to move with them. It's like trying to build on a foundation that hasn't fully set. You can stack the bricks, you can build the walls, but it won't hold. Eventually, it collapses.
And I imagine there's also pressure from the calendar itself. January feels like a natural starting point. So there's this sense that you have to launch everything right away.
Absolutely. There's this cultural narrative around January as a fresh start, a clean slate, new year, new you, new strategy. And that narrative creates artificial urgency. And leaders think if we don't launch in January, we've already lost momentum. But what they're not considering is whether their people are in a place to receive what they're launching. You can have the best strategy in the world, but if you're presenting it to people who are burned out, skeptical, or disengaged, it doesn't matter. The timing is wrong.
So there's an overlooked truth in all of this, isn't there? Something that leaders fundamentally misunderstand about how culture works.
Yes, the overlooked truth is that culture resets whether you lead it or not. People are already deciding in January what they believe about the organization, about leadership, about their own future there. They're forming opinions. They're making assessments. They're determining how much effort they're willing to invest this year. That process is happening with or without leadership's involvement. The question isn't whether a reset happens. The question is whether you're intentionally shaping it or whether you're letting it shape itself by default. And when you let it shape itself, it rarely shapes in your favor.
That's such a powerful reframe. It shifts the question from, should we do this, to how are we doing this? Because it's already happening.
Exactly. And once you understand that, it changes everything about how you approach January. It's no longer optional. It's not something you do if you have time after the strategic planning is done. It becomes the prerequisite for everything else you're trying to accomplish.
That's a powerful reframe. So let's talk about implications. What actually happens when leaders ignore this cultural reset? What are the real costs?
There are several cascading effects, and they're all costly. First, you get what I call performative engagement. People show up to work. They attend the meetings. They complete their tasks. But they're not actually invested. They're going through the motions. They're waiting to see if things actually change before they commit any real energy or creativity or discretionary effort. And you can feel this in an organization. There's a flatness to the energy. Ideas don't flow. Innovation stalls. People do what's required, but nothing more.
And that's different from active disengagement, right? It's more subtle.
It's much more subtle, which is why it's so dangerous. Active disengagement is visible. People complain, they push back, they disengage, obviously, but performative engagement looks fine on the surface. People aren't causing problems, they're not missing deadlines. So leadership often doesn't recognize it as a problem until much later when they realize nothing is actually moving forward with any real momentum.
So that's the first implication. What's the second?
Second, you lose your highest performers first. The people with options, the ones you most want to keep, the ones who are most valuable to your organization, they're the first to leave when they sense the culture isn't actually shifting because they have choices. They're getting recruited. They're seeing opportunities elsewhere. And if they don't believe things are going to be different this year, they're not going to stick around to find out. They'll take the opportunity that feels more promising.
And that creates a vicious cycle, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, because when your top performers leave, the workload doesn't decrease. It gets redistributed to the people who remain, which means those people are now even more overworked than they were before, which reinforces the exact cultural problem that caused the first person to leave. So then more people leave, and you end up in this downward spiral that's very difficult to reverse.
What's the third implication?
Third, and this is perhaps the most insidious, you create a credibility gap that's extremely hard to recover from. If you launch a new strategy in January without addressing the cultural foundation and it doesn't land and people watch it fail or fizzle out, they remember that. It becomes part of the organizational narrative. It becomes a story people tell. Remember when leadership said this year would be different and then nothing changed? And the next time you try to rally people around something new, they're even more skeptical. They've seen this before. They don't believe you. You're not just losing the current moment. You're mortgaging future moments. You're spending credibility you'll need later.
So it's not just about this January, it's about every January going forward.
Exactly. Every time you miss this opportunity, you make the next one harder. The skepticism compounds. The trust erodes further. And eventually, you reach a point where people simply don't believe anything leadership says, regardless of how good the strategy is or how genuine the intentions are. You've cried wolf too many times.
So given how costly this is, why does this pattern persist? If leaders can see the consequences, why do organizations keep making the same mistake year after year?
Because it's significantly easier to focus on strategy than culture. Strategy feels concrete and manageable. You can put it in a deck. You can present it to the board. You can measure it with KPIs and track progress in dashboards. It feels like real work. Culture, on the other hand, feels squishy and ambiguous. It's hard to quantify. It's hard to measure. And it requires leaders to do things that are genuinely uncomfortable. It requires vulnerability. It requires admitting what didn't work last year. It requires listening more than talking. It requires sitting in difficult conversations without immediately jumping to solutions. Most leaders aren't trained for that. They're trained to solve problems, to make decisions, to drive results. Cultural work doesn't fit that model.
So there's a skill gap as much as an awareness gap?
Absolutely. Many leaders simply don't know how to do this work. They don't know how to facilitate a conversation about culture. They don't know what questions to ask. They don't know how to create the conditions for honest feedback. So they default to what they do know, which is strategy and execution. And they tell themselves that's enough. They tell themselves that if they just execute well enough, the culture will take care of itself. But it doesn't work that way.
Where do leaders most often misjudge this? What's the most common miscalculation?
They misjudge the readiness of their people. They make a fundamental attribution error. They assume that because people are physically back in the office or back online, they're psychologically ready to engage. They see people in meetings and think, great, everyone's here, we can move forward. But readiness isn't about physical presence. It's about psychological safety. It's about trust. It's about belief that things can actually be different this time. If those foundational elements aren't in place, no amount of strategic clarity will matter. You can have the clearest vision in the world, but if people don't believe it's achievable or don't trust that leadership will follow through, they won't engage with it.
So it's almost like leaders are measuring the wrong thing. They're measuring attendance when they should be measuring belief.
That's exactly right, and belief is much harder to measure. You can't just look at who showed up to the meeting. You have to pay attention to what people aren't saying. You have to notice the energy in the room. You have to create space for people to express doubt or concern without being shut down. That requires a completely different skill set than most strategic planning requires.
This is really resonating, Elizabeth. I think a lot of leaders listening right now are recognizing themselves in this pattern. Maybe they're realizing they've already made some of these mistakes this January, or they're seeing how they made them last January and the year before that.
I hope so, because recognition is the first step. You can't change a pattern you don't see. And the good news, the really important thing to understand is that January is still a powerful moment, even if you've already missed some of these opportunities. It's not too late. We're still in the window where you can course correct, but it requires a genuine shift in how leaders think about this time. It's not just about what you're launching or what initiatives you're rolling out. It's about what you're listening for, what you're paying attention to, and what you're willing to address, even when it's uncomfortable.
So for leaders who are hearing this conversation and recognizing they may have missed this reset, or they want to approach the rest of January and February differently, what's the invitation here? What's the first step?
The invitation is to pause and ask fundamentally better questions, not just the standard questions like, what do we need to accomplish this year? What are our goals? What's our strategy? Those questions have their place, but they're not sufficient. The better questions are things like, what do our people need to believe is possible before they'll fully engage? What do they need to see from us as leaders that they haven't seen before? What conversations have we been avoiding because they're difficult or uncomfortable? What feedback have we been dismissing because we didn't want to hear it? Those questions create the conditions for real change. They open up space for the cultural reset to happen intentionally rather than by default.
And I imagine those questions require leaders to be genuinely open to the answers, not just asking performatively.
Absolutely. You can't ask those questions unless you're prepared to actually hear the answers and do something with them. If you ask what people need to see from you and then you don't change anything, you've made the problem worse, not better. You've confirmed that leadership asks but doesn't listen. So there has to be genuine openness and genuine willingness to change. Otherwise, don't ask the question.
And for leaders who want to explore these kinds of challenges more deeply, we do offer a brief executive perspective call. It's simply a space to exchange perspective and determine whether deeper work would be useful. You can find the link and email in the description below.
That's a great resource. These aren't challenges you have to navigate alone.
Elizabeth, thank you for this conversation. I think we've given leaders a lot to think about.
Thanks for having me, Judith. I hope this helps someone make a different choice this January.
And thank you to everyone listening. We'll see you in the next episode.